computer. All right, hey everybody, Joe Palmer here with our first TusCon 47 event. Melanie Lenart is going to be talking about world building using actual science. First thing I have to do though is pay some bills. We've got some wonderful sponsors this year and we're hoping they like us and keep sponsoring us in the future. We got Bookman's, who's always great to have around, Nova Home Loans, Community Investment Corporation, Brick Cave Media, who publish actually a lot of our favorite authors. They're right up in Phoenix. Silver Sea, Tucson's favorite jewelry store. I think she even won best of them this year. Year of the Cat Soaps, Art by Ale, James Pack, Left Hand Asylum, Creatively Queer Press, Estee Shower, Goth Geek, the Traveling Cabinet of Curiosities, who were in the dealer's room last year, totally awesome. Dragon and Wolfcraft, Hops and Vines, Tucson Games and Gadgets, and Joel Studler. All right, Melanie, let's go ahead and start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thanks so much for inviting me to do this. And now I see how you've been pulling it off all these years, all those sponsors really helping, because it's an amazing conference. And we were just talking, we were saying, you know, it's been going on for almost 50 years now. So it's just, I'm very glad to be part of this. Let's see. Oops, I guess you're going to need to put this, let me do the screen sharing in order for that to work. And just so you guys know, I am in a rural area in Tucson that doesn't always have the best internet. So if anything happens with the my connection, we've pre-taped it and Joe will slip into that. But I hope that doesn't happen today because it's so much more fun interacting with a group, you know. And as far as questions, there is the chat box, and sometimes it's hard for the speakers to monitor that, but I know Joe will help me out, and I'll probably pause for questions after maybe a couple of different sections in here, but and at the end we can even go over, Joe said that's fine for us to go over if people have questions, want to talk about some of their experience, that'd be great. So let me try that screen sharing again. There we go. And I'll just explain myself more once I start because I've got a slide for that. Oops, sorry. Okay, so now I want to also be able to see the chat, so I'm going to put that on. So, okay, so yes, I'm talking today about planetary ecology to consider when world building for TusCon. Oops, why is this not going? Okay, there we go. So that picture that was on the front, now when you guys look at my screen, do you see the chat box covering things?
No, it's okay.
No, okay. I can't really see it too well. So
yes.
You do? Okay, I'm gonna leave the chat box off, but if there's anything pressing, Joe, would you interrupt me and let me know? And otherwise I'll try to pause every once in a while.
Will do.
Thank you.
It's not like your chat box we see, but our chat box where it floats over.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this is Amy Thompson novel, one of my favorites. She just does such a great job with the ecology of an alien planet, The Color of Distance, and some really interesting aliens. And so if you look at this planet and read some of the stuff, you might get a feeling for, you know, what kind of climate or vegetation we've got. I mean, they've got it illustrated here, but there's trees. She leaped through the tree and bounded through the canopy. There's a swarm of Tillon buzzing around her, and we'll understand those play the role of bees from how she describes it. She climbed in the hollow tree trunk and reached a pool of water at the bottom. So I don't know if anybody wants to jump in and say what kind of climate they think that one might be.
It almost sounds like temperate or tropical rainforest.
Tropical rainforest, yeah. If you look at the image they've got here, at least where they are located, you know, it's kind of fern-like plants here. These alien fruits look almost like bananas, which are very tropical, kind of ferny things. So, you know, she's following some of the rules that you know of our planet's ecology, which makes sense because hopefully as I go through some of this, you might see how this would be maybe a bit more universal rather than just planetary. And, you know, there can be changes and differences, but these are good. I tried to stick to kind of some of the concepts that might be more universal. Why am I having trouble? Okay. All right. So what I want to focus on here is, we'll be talking about how the vegetation generally reflects the climate.
I tried to put this on there, I don't know if there's Zoom.
Oh, I think that's somebody just
Oh.
just muted. And Joe, I think you have the right to mute people, right?
Yeah, he should. There you go.
So how the climate works, because, partly because it's such a big effect on vegetation, but also because it's its own, excitement and natural force, really, sometimes that your characters might be dealing with. How it relates to ecosystem type and some of the basic categories of life forms. I'm going to stick to like 3 to 5, you would call it, depending on how you break those down. And then we'll consider whether a planet might be a life form. So why me? Why should I be talking about this? Well, I've been a long time reader of science fiction and fantasy, so that's probably the main reason, because I got attracted to this stuff. And I'm actually writing it now after many years of working in the natural sciences, teaching science at University of Arizona and Tohono Community College, and some writing courses at there and Pima Community College. And I do have a PhD in natural resources and the environment, where I basically went to find that get my degree so I could write the book I show here, Life in the Hothouse, How a Living Planet Survives Climate Change. Not that I had to go through a whole degree to write a book. Don't let me scare you like that. I think I was a little over ambitious there. But just that I wanted to really understand the planet in depth. So I spent a lot of time at this. So hopefully it'll help me provide an overview rather than detail here. So just giving you a quick look at how our world's vegetation looks. Obviously you can't really see the legend too much, but as you might imagine, the green parts are forest, and here's our tropical rainforest that we were just talking about, for a different planet. Then you've got your deserts, the orange areas. Here's our desert. And then you've got your boreal forest, and there's grasslands and other things in here too. I mean, this is a very large scale image, and I actually do like to talk at the large scale. So just keep in mind, I'm talking at the large scale, not always at the detail. So if you look at precipitation now, you can see the precipitation is a lot of the water. So the darker colors being more rainfall, basically, and some snowfall, but in some places, not the tropics. The tropics is rainfall. You can see, it's very concentrated here. Then our deserts have less rainfall, as we kind of understand. And then the boreal forests have certain rainfall. Now, this is actually just 1 month. This is May, but I think it's pretty reflective of summer rainfall, which is what's going to be important for plant growth in our northern hemisphere. That's not the tropics. So that's why I showed that. And if you put these two things together, you'll see how they do kind of, you can see how they reflect each other, where basically the more rainfall you have, the more forest you have. Forests need a lot of rain, and so that's what you tend to get. If it's, well, I'll go into more details on some of that. So just to jump back on why that rainfall is so concentrated in the forest, I wanted to show you an image of our globe with its tilt. So the tilt of our Earth, which is basically it's 23.5 degrees off the axis here. And that's not unusual. Many planets have tilts, many moons and things like that. Some of them are very minor, but this is probably a midway tilt. But for the Earth, this is typically what we have. We go from maybe 21 to 25 at the most. So we stay within a small range, and that would be over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So we've been at this one for a while. And what that means is, as our planet rotates and goes around the sun, different parts of the planet are getting the more direct solar radiation. So here's the point where the solar radiation is coming in directly on the planet. Other places it's somewhat directly, some of them not at all directly. And but before I go into more detail on that, I just wanted to show an illustration here about how other planets also have tilt. So you can see the Earth we're at 23.5. Mars is at about 25. Pluto's got a really tilted axis, and the moon and Mercury are barely tilted at all. So there's a lot of variety out there. Mars, which is shown here, actually goes from about 10 degrees off its axis to 40 degrees sometimes. Currently it's at about 20. Oh, I guess this is the 10. Sorry. There's the 10. Here's the 25 where it is now. There's the 40 degrees off its axis. Here's 10 degrees off its axis, very little. So you can see, you know, in this imagery from NASA, you can see how the tilt really has a lot to do with not only seasons, but how much ice can build up. So when Mars's tilt was 40 degrees, you know, you would actually have ice in fairly near what is technically the equator, right? Because it's directly the perpendicular from the axis. So from the true axis. So, but when it was hardly tilted at all, you're not getting much variation. So the ice can really build up at the poles. Now, Mars's atmosphere is mostly carbon dioxide. So this is not watery ice, it's carbon dioxide ice, but it's ice. All right, so getting back to the Earth, what this means is the area where the sun is directly overhead just varies from our summer solstice on June 21st, when it is at 23.5 degrees north. Notice that tilt takes it 23.5 degrees north of the equator because it's tilted that much. And so what that really brings a lot of heat to our northern summer. And as it goes back down through time, you know, this is obviously just a illustration, the sun, you know, the Earth circling around the sun and things like that. But this is where, so at our equinox, our spring and fall equinox is when the sun is falling directly straight on the equator at 0 degrees. And so it goes through that as it's coming from summer over to fall. And then at winter is when it's that far down, that far south, for at the Tropic of Cancer, 23.5 degrees south, giving the southern atmosphere their summer. So that's that. And why is direct sunlight so important? Well, it's far more intense than indirect sunlight. You can kind of see this flashlight show. Basically what you've got is the same amount of solar radiation, or in this case, radiation from the flashlight, coming onto a smaller area than if it's at more of an angle. And another thing on our planet that makes it more of an issue is when you're coming in from direct sunlight, your atmosphere is you're going through less atmosphere as you come in. As the sunlight comes in, it's more direct, so it doesn't get blocked as much. As it gets less direct, it goes through more atmosphere. And that's kind of, we experience that every day as sunrise and sunset, when the sun is going through the atmosphere and it's being muted. And it can even look really pretty. But, you know, this direct sunlight can be very powerful. And, you know, like last summer, I spent some time with, not this last one, but the one before, with my nieces and nephews in Puerto Rico. And, you know, I tried to tell them, look, the sun here is different. It's in the tropics. Don't, you know, try to avoid being out in the sun from 10 to 2 because it's too hot. They're like, you know, they were young college kids. They're like, whatever, we don't get bothered by sun. Wow, half of them got blistered. They got all kinds of weird things from that direct sun that didn't feel that bad, but it does make a difference. So, you know, that does matter. So here is just an image now, back thinking of the large scale again of what this means. So here's the direct sunlight coming in at the equator, and it, you know, there, if you look at a globe, you'll see there's a lot of water around the equator. You know, that area in the tropics, our planet is 70% water anyway, and a lot of that is around the equator. Most of our land at this stage of the game is in the northern hemisphere. So, you know, there's a lot of water to evaporate. So that direct, powerful sunlight is coming in, evaporating the water very heavily and moving it up, and a lot of rainfall around the equator, around the tropics in general. Then as you move out, what happens is that, you know, what goes up must come down. So that air that moved up and released its rain, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that works in a minute. Now that descending air starts to come down and we get our high pressure zones, that, it's pushing down warm, dry air. And that's why we get the deserts where we have them, partially why. Yeah, that's one of the reasons. So that is something to keep in mind on, and that would be true of any planet. So the equator, where your tilt is, you can see the tilt defines where your tropics are and how they behave. Now, this is a little bit of an unusual way of showing these things, but I've got the Earth tilted so the equator is up here, so it matches the image we were just looking at, where that air is coming up and then coming back down on our deserts. And meanwhile, you can also compare it on the side to, you see how with the global precipitation, this is year-round precipitation. And so you can see that, again, why that is so much rainfall there, and why at 30 degrees we tend to get most of our serious deserts. I mean, at least we're not like the Sahara over here, right? And part of that is because there's so much land around this area. It's kind of continental effect where you're not able to get a lot of water to some of that region. So you get a lot of desert and grassland. But the reason I show this with it is I wanted to show there's other circulation patterns that come up. So the desert, you've got the descending air. And by the way, so on the Weather Channel, you might hear that called like a ridge or things like that. And that was very instrumental in the dry summer we had here in the West this past summer and all the wildfires. So, I'm not going into details on those kind of annual variability issues, but keep in mind that with these big picture things, you're going to have a lot of variability too. Anyway, as the deserts, the deserts actually lose a lot of water, and that's part of the reason, because we are losing a lot to evaporation, and some of that water then is going back up to these mid latitudes, which I tend to call the temperate zone, just for the sake of this talk, where you get freezing temperatures, but it's also not year-round freezing. And then there's another one up by the poles. So that area tends to be wet, which for some reason these arrows are red. It should be blue in my opinion. But and then they get dry again. So the polar area is actually a desert. And you look here on global precipitation, you'll see there's not a lot of rainfall actually up at the poles. But the reason that we still get vegetation and boreal forests up there is because it's so cold that there's not a lot of evaporation going on. So all these things kind of interact. Let's see. Okay, so just to take a little detour here, because you can apply this to other hotter planets or colder planets too. Our own planet, this is our circulation currently, but in colder times, what we saw is because it was colder, water's colder, the air is colder, there's not as much, the evaporation isn't getting it as high. This arrow isn't quite doing it justice. It's just trying to show that it's shorter. So what would happen is the air basically is falling sooner because it's not getting as high. It doesn't have as much energy from lack of heat. So instead, then some of the desert areas like the dunes in the Sahara, whoops, they're on the other side of the globe, they were centered on 15 degrees, so closer to the equator, what is our tropics actually. And instead of 25 degrees where they are in modern times, 25, 30. So that's a colder climate. Things slow down, they kind of sputter. And it was a lot drier as a whole, by the way, with less water being evaporated because of the colder temperatures. It was probably globally average about 2/3 as wet as what we have now. Now, we had interglacial climates too. Those would be a little bit different. What I'm talking about here is a hothouse climate when it's much hotter and there's no permanent ice around. So that would have been going back, 50 million years. We had a big one until about 35 million years ago. We were in kind of these hothouse climates for a lot of Earth's time frame. But there's evidence that suggests that during that time it was the water cycle and the evaporation rates were so invigorated that water was just not even coming down and creating deserts. There's evidence for tropical storm moisture up here at the poles, which means that's being carried, making its way up there. Is that a question or okay, that was just an accident. So anyway, that's, and it was actually quite wet during the hothouse climate. Now, again, that's not what we're talking about for the near future here. So be careful about putting too much on what's going to happen here. But you know, hey, at the rate we're going, we might get there. Hopefully not, but you know, that's just to give you an extreme example. And it was very extreme. There was a lot of rainfall, and rainfall would have been probably at least double of what we're seeing currently, because the temperature was 80, 85 degrees for the globe as a whole. So in this case, there may have been a largely tropical environment and there were big trees like the Pacific Northwest rainforest, redwoods and stuff growing up at the poles. So, you know, there was a lot of moisture and a lot of vegetation at that time. But, you know, I just want to make sure it's clear, like if we're talking about our planet moving into that, it's going to go through a lot of variability and a lot of intermediate dangerous stages before it would settle on something like that. And I'm not sure that would do that well for civilization anyway. So I'm not promoting that we go to a hothouse climate. I'm just saying, here's what it was like. Because water cycle does speed up with a warm climate. Basically, the sun launches the water cycle through evaporation, which we've been kind of talking about. It kind of makes sense. You might have had some of this. So the sun launches it, then it starts to, you know, condense, form clouds. If it gets cold enough, or, you know, if the full enough of water, it'll precipitate. And then that comes down your mountains, feeds the plants, goes in the groundwater in the rivers and makes its way back to the ocean. So that's the very simplified version of the water cycle. And, you know, so just keep in mind, as we've been saying, evaporation rates do increase as temperature goes up. And we kind of know that, those of us who are in Tucson kind of know that, because if you look at, you know, the summer temperatures when it's really hot, I mean, if you ever try to dry some clothes outside, or even try to cool off by wetting your hair down, it dries off in 5 minutes. So in the winter, you know, that might take an hour or even days in our climate, or a day in our winter climate. But meanwhile, there's not as much moisture in the air. Like I notice it because I have to put a lot of moisturizer on my hands during the winter, or they will just crack. So, and I don't have to do that during summer, even though it's hotter, and you would think evaporation, it would go up.
I don't think so.
So, okay. So like I said, on our planet, because we are 70% water, those warmer temperatures are going to boost the air moisture because they're boosting evaporation rates. So what we find is that with every 18 degrees in Fahrenheit that you go up, you're about doubling the water vapor in the atmosphere. Now that's just the water vapor. That doesn't necessarily mean you're doubling rainfall, because you still have to get that rain down. There's other issues. And some of it does stay in the air. I think we've probably all experienced an unpleasantly humid climate at some point in our life, where it's like, oh, you can't see the water, but you can feel it. You know it's there. And but in the meantime, you know, that's something to keep in mind. And we are talking about, for our planet, an increase of potentially, you know, 10 degrees Fahrenheit if we don't watch out. Hopefully a lot less. But you know, so we might see. We can expect to see an increase in precipitation and flooding, like we're already seeing on the eastern side of the continent. And then, of course, that evaporation for those of us when we don't get rain, like this horrible summer we had this last one, you know, we're losing a lot of moisture to evaporation and not replacing it. So that's our challenge. So keep in mind, water vapor is a greenhouse gas. Which means, you know, one way we notice that is during when it's humid, say those of you from Tucson during the summer monsoon, it takes a lot longer to cool off at night because that air is still holding some of that heat. And so, you know, I know a lot of you are in humid climates, even if you're not in Tucson. And so you've noticed that in the summer, sometimes it's just so hard to sleep because it's hot and humid, and that humidity holds in the heat. Whereas, you know, when there's less of it, we can cool off. Like here in the desert, you know, I know now at this time of year, as dry as it is, once the sun goes down, it's instantly like 10 degrees cooler. So humidity is the amount of water vapor in the air. Relative humidity, which you've no doubt heard some along the line, is the amount of water vapor as a percentage of what that particular air parcel could hold. So air tends to move in parcels, almost like a air balloon without the coating around it. And so basically, know, let's just say some air picks up a bunch of moisture from the ocean surface, and then it's moving up. As it gets further up in the atmosphere, and I think this next slide shows it. Yeah, as it gets further up in the atmosphere gets colder as you go up. This one's showing it sideways because this is following, you know, that line of the things. But anyway, as you get up into the atmosphere, it gets colder because there's less of it. There's, you know, the atmosphere is more concentrated as you get closer to the surface. And so it doesn't heat, you know, as it dissipates, so does the heat. Anyway, once you get that air parcel that had a certain amount of water in it, maybe it was 50% relative humidity, so 50% saturated for that hot air. Now you've got it moved way up into the atmosphere where it's very cold, and that's where it can start to condense. Because maybe for that, since warmer air holds more water vapor, now this colder air, it's got more than it can handle. So it'll just start to drop that as rain or snow or things that happen. So mountains actually help move those the air parcels up, and you know, just really have a big effect on rainfall, especially in the West. We're very lucky to have these mountains, and that's probably one of the reasons the West isn't as bad as the Sahara. Besides the continental effect, that we've got a lot more mountains that can help us out with some variability and boosting those clouds into the air. So so here in Arizona, you will find that our rainfall, this is where we have our white mountains, the Mogollon Rim here. And so this rainfall map, which shows, you know, average annual precipitation with the blue being more and the red being less, you can see it's very concentrated around our mountains in general. And this too, this is a temperature map, kind of a temperature map. It's for plant hardiness, like where you're going to get freezing zones. So you can see those are also going to be concentrated in the mountains. And the lower you get, you know, the warmer it gets in general in our situation. So we're lucky to have that kind of variability, because we could all be like Yuma if we, you know, didn't have so much excellent geography here. So besides mountains, mountains are one way you can get the clouds up. That's orographic lifting. There's two other ways you can get it up, and one is convection. Convection is when, you know, the surface heats. It's basically if you're watching a pot of water boil, you can see convection. It's, you know, as there's heat from below, so the planet's surface that's been catching all the sun rays is now heating up the air, and that air is getting warmer and hot air rises. So now that air starts to rise and eventually gets to a cold enough place, we hope, to form clouds and even rain if we're lucky. The other way it can do it is through frontal lifting, which is a cold front coming in and then a warm front goes over it, because again, warm air is going to be lighter and hot air rises. So the cold air is going to come through and push that warm air up and serve as kind of a mountain. So if you've got those kind of things, so that's just another thing to keep in mind for your planet, is how much your local geography can change what you're looking at too. So keep that in mind. Here's a little illustration of how that works. And as Joe pointed out, this could be describing California, the Cascades, or any, you know, a lot of mountains that we see, where you got your ocean and you've got, you know, where you're coming up here, you've got moist air, so lots of good vegetation. You've got rainfall that tends to come down on this side. And then by the time that rain is done, it starts coming down the other side and it's hot, dry air. Your Santa Anas or things like that, they're just drying things out. So, you know, if you look at some of the mountain ranges over there on the Pacific Northwest, you'll see beautiful lush forests and the, you know, the temperate rainforest on one side, and the other side you get kind of ponderosa pines like we have in our mountains here in Arizona. So that is another, you know, just even a geographic feature, and that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind if you're talking about local geography too. So this one, I feel like it's a tiny bit out of place, but anyway, warmer climates will have more extreme rainfall and tropical storms, which we kind of touched on. And precipitation in a warming world tends to increase almost everywhere, but, you know, some places have high enough evaporation that you still might suffer from it. Or let's not forget about variability. And that's something you will also be able to work in to your climate. So with variability, you know, on a annual basis, you are going to have some changes. For Tucson, we usually, like our monsoon rainfall, it's usually could be like half to double during the monsoon. What our average is 6, we usually 3 inches would be low and 12 inches would be really high. And that was the range until this past summer. And I think we got 1.5 inches or something, depending on where you're at. So, you know, we are getting into an even more extreme time. So you might be developing a planet that's more extreme. Maybe things can be more extreme than usual. That's where you get a lot of trouble. Even in the tropics that are used to a lot of rainfall, you know, if you do have a few months of drying, you've got all that vegetation that's been built up, and, you know, they've got some options, but, you know, it doesn't take too many years like that before you really start to suffer. So, and, you know, we've talked about the energy of the water cycle, but I think it's also good to keep in mind, we're talking the energy of the storm, the energy of the system. So that can also be wind speed, if you're talking hurricanes, or lightning. You know, tropical storms, they're expending energy with lightning too. So, you know, all of those can be more dramatic in a warmer climate than a cooler climate. And you can, some of you who live in climates that have more, well, I think probably most of us live in climates that have seasons, but, you know, so you can see that too with like a winter in Chicago compared to a summer in Chicago, how the precipitation differs, and you don't really get the thunderstorms much outside of the warm season. So tropical storms, which include hurricanes, are also more intense. And we've seen this in this year's hurricane season. They ran out of names for the hurricanes and had to start going to the Greek symbols, letters. And so, you know, we broke the 2005 record for number of named storms. And a lot of those were really intense because those hurricanes are, and tropical storms in general. When I say tropical storm, that would include any thunderstorm basically, but the hurricanes and the named tropical storms are of, you know, a certain size, and with a hurricane they would have an eye in the middle, and also the wind speeds around them have certain energy levels that they that defines them. And so basically hurricanes in general need water temperature, sea surface temperatures. So for the Atlantic hurricanes, we're talking about sea surface temperatures by, you know, Alaska or in the Atlantic. By Alaska, I meant to say by Africa, sorry. So they need temperatures of 80 degrees to form and about 83 degrees for major hurricanes. So, and one thing we haven't been hearing a lot about, but I think we'll be hearing about it in the next 5 or 10 years, is how these temperatures are, because the Earth has been absorbing a lot of the extra warming from climate change and global warming in the water. The water is being warmer for deeper down, and that is going to have an effect that hasn't really been considered too much as far as I've seen. So, you know, that is also going to affect the hurricanes. And even our monsoon rainfall is affected by the temperature of the water bodies near us. In this particular study that it refers to here was done in the Gulf of California, finding that basically when the Gulf of California, the sea surface temperatures there increased, that's when our monsoon would tend to kick in to that 80 degrees. So again, you know, just thinking about the extreme planets that you might create or that we might be headed to if we're not careful, you know, this would be a ways off. But during the Cretaceous, when it was really hot, this is just showing like hurricane storms that were reconstructed from how they affected the sand, basically the hummocks, wavelengths. I won't go into detail on that, but just keep in mind that those kind of storms were much, much stronger than what we've been seeing closer to our time, you know, down this way. So we've already been talking about adding a new category for the Saffir-Simpson scale, which goes up to 5. We're already talking about adding a scale, a 6. I can imagine what these guys probably had a 10 or something. So, you know, it would be hard to get a climate that's really hot without having some intense storms. So you'll want to keep that in mind. All right, so that's kind of mostly the section on climate. Which I don't know if I mentioned, I used to work for the climate assessment for the Southwest too. So it's always been a, you know, interest of mine, and hopefully didn't go into too much. But does anybody have any questions or anything before we start moving on to how the vegetation relates?
Well, one thing that I've that we experience here in Tucson is that you're looking at the intensity of the solar radiation, that as you get more altitude as well, it becomes much more intense as well.
Yeah, you know what? That's a really good point. The altitude issue is a good one from a lot of angles. And that actually kind of fits into this, where one thing we see when we go up a mountain is you can go through 4 or 5 different climate vegetation zones as you go up a mountain. And so I think, what are you referring to, Brian? You're talking about the sun is more intense, but I think part of that would be the angle of it, right? Is
Well,
that what you're talking about? Because
you get you get angle issue. You also get just the altitude, and that the sun feels more intense because it's going through less air.
that's right.
But you also, and then it also affects some evaporation, because as you go higher, it gets cooler. So there's a big balance thing going on there.
That's right. Very good point. And so, an interesting thing about that too is, even though the sun may be more intense because it's coming through less atmosphere, as Brian pointed out, it still is a little cooler because there's less atmosphere, the higher altitude. And then you're getting some extra precipitation around the mountains for the reasons we were just talking about. So that's where we get our forest. So we're so lucky to have mountains, so we can have a little forest escape sometimes. And this, let's just look at this. So this would be kind of like going up a mountain in Tucson, where we've got our desert climate here. And let me just explain what this is looking at first. So we're going from a warmer temperature to a cooler temperature here, and less rainfall to more rainfall this way. So you can see, as you have less rainfall, regardless of how warm you are, you're not going to be able to get much life. Water is life, and water needs life to live. But we do have pretty lush desert, it's considered, in Tucson with our plants. But then as you were to go up a mountain, you'd hit the grasslands and the oak savanna. We would actually kind of go up this way then. We tend to hit the pine trees next. We have a lot of ponderosa forests around here and different Doug fern pines. So, that's kind of like going up a mountain. And it's interesting because this is going up in, our temperature. You could think of this as the equator, this as the subtropics, this as the temperate zone, and this as the polar zone. So we kind of can get the equivalent of the temperate zone. And I know a lot of us like to go up to the mountains in the summer to get that 20 or 30 degree temperature drop. I guess it's probably more like 20 for our mountains. But, and we even have some deciduous trees up on top of Mount Lemmon, which is at about 7,000 feet or so. And so that would be, those are the trees. By deciduous, that just means they lose their leaves. And so that can be a nice adaptation, because they tend to be a little more productive than pine trees, but they only work seasonally, and the pine trees are year round. So, there are, in the tropics, those deciduous trees don't lose their leaves in general, unless there's a drought. Some of them might, but you just don't see leafless trees much in the tropics, except for a hurricane. But anyway, you can see as you add I don't know how much you can tell from this, because this rainforest is actually fairly sparse compared to what it would really be, but you're going to have the most mass of life in a hot, warm climate. And then as you go further up, it'll get a little bit less, but the water is the key, and temperature is kind of the other factor.
You actually have one of those displays of the different climate zones in boxes, of examples at the Desert Museum. They actually have those to show you what it's like going up the mount from the desert up to Mount Lemmon.
Very nice. Maybe I'll go take pictures of it for a future talk. And actually, Joe, were there any questions in the chat box that we should touch before going more into vegetation?
Yeah, Jacob was talking about, or asked about more lightning in warmer times, and I partially answered it. Then Dawn had a follow-up. So the more violent weather, is it because of the fronts? But I think it's really because of the cycle, right? The cells.
Yeah, the lightning itself. That I'm not as familiar with the rules of lightning. I know it has to do with negative and positive charges. So, but I don't really totally get why they're more prevalent in the warmer climates. But I think I just tend to bring it back to the basics, which is there's more energy in the system. You know, you get a lot of thunderstorms. Sometimes you can't hear the lightning. Like I noticed when when I used to live in the Puerto Rico for many years and in the tropics, and there was a lot of rain a lot of the time, but I didn't always hear the lightning. And I think sometimes it's so high up, you're not always hearing it. But I do remember some storms where it was really right next door. But, you know, I noticed that summer we'll get more of our lightning. I just think it's something about the energy of the system and kind of the, you know, it's like the rain we get here tends to be in the winter, tends to be drizzly, smooth. Those kind of storms tend to just be gentle, and you know, they're usually they can be convection, or you know, we'll get some of the storms from the jet stream coming in. It's the summer storms that are violent, sometimes very small and very, you know, flash flooding that happens. And hurricanes will have a lot of lightning in them too. Although, you know, with all the winds and rains going on, you don't necessarily notice it as much.
Yeah, I think it's the in this climate and in Florida, it's because you get the thermals actually take the columns so high up. You get these really, really tall, up to almost 50,000 feet clouds, and that big difference between the top of the cloud and the bottom cloud, you can build up a lot more of a charge. That's where you get a lot of the lightning.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And we do have a much taller atmosphere around the tropics than we do around the poles. It kind of, you know, gets its biggest height in the tropics and comes down. And we do, you know, basically during our monsoon season, what happens is the tropics kind of move up here. So we have more tropical conditions, literally. Was there another one that you mentioned, Joe? Or was that?
I think Mira just asked, how close do you have to be to lightning to feel the electricity? I think really close, right? Scary close.
Think so. I know I was I didn't feel the electricity one time when I was standing near, you know, I was probably about a block or two away from a lightning thing and heard it. My dog freaked out, but I didn't feel the electricity. So I, you know, that's not, I don't know exactly, but I don't think you'd feel it too much unless it actually hit you. So, all right, well, you know, we'll have time for questions at the end too. So let's just try to get this in so people listening to it too can get it in a more cohesive thing, and then we'll have more questions. So, so just looking at how the vegetation reflects the climate, we looked at this slide, and now just getting into how some of the leaves and trees. Now, I tend to focus on trees, I'm going to admit. So this is from a project we did with fruit trees from Linking Edible Arizona Forest. If anyone is interested in growing fruit trees here, you can look that up. And basically, if you guys were looking at this, which one, I kind of cheated because I put the fruit in there, but which one of these is tropical? Anybody want to volunteer that?
The oranges.
Number 2. Brian says the second one. That's right. This one is, it's got, you know, the leaves here are very smooth. That tends to reflect a warm climate. And in this one, you can tell there's also, this tree is expecting a lot of rainfall because they've got drip tips. They actually have the trees, the leaves are set to just let that water fall down. They know there's going to be too much. They don't want to be holding it. And of course, there's oranges growing, so that would be another sign. So let me I actually will discuss these in the next one. So these tropical ones, so what these kind of smooth leaves and tropical trees suggest that there's no freezing temperatures. And it was someone, is that a question or is that someone talking? Okay, I think that's just someone talking on the phone or something. So, so even if, you know, like even if it goes down to 40 degrees for several days in a row, like it did probably about a decade ago now in Yuma, they lost a lot of their citrus crop just from not even hitting freezing. So they don't really like those cool temperatures. On the other hand, they don't really like hot temperatures either because they're used to having cloudy skies and moist, humid air. So because of the air is so moist and humid, the temperatures rarely go over 100 degrees, you know, from the thermometer's perspective. And that's basically because the moisture on the ground and in the air and in the plants takes some heat with it when it evaporates. So that's why we got so hot this summer when it was so dry. It's kind of a double whammy at the same time. There's no water to evaporate to temper that heating, and it's just crazy hot. We broke all kinds of records this summer in Tucson. So, but these guys they have the smooth leaves and drip tips. So that's something to keep in mind if you have a warm climate. The temperate trees, these are the ones that are growing, the apples, peaches, plums, pears, etc., that are growing. We can get like figs and pomegranates and mulberries around here. This is a mulberry tree, but some of those are a little harder to grow because they actually require cool temperatures. They require so-called chill hours. So not even freezing temperatures. They have to get temperatures between 32 and 45 degrees that they register a certain number, usually 100 hours or 300 hours or something that the plant registers. Oh, okay, I think winter's over now. Had a lot of chill hours, so let me start thinking about resprouting. But one thing you'll see with these temperate tree leaves is they'll tend to be ragged. Like, see how the edges here are kind of not smooth, basically, like your maple leaves and things like that. That's what you'll see in a climate that does have freezing temperatures sometimes. And our subtropical trees, notice a lot of those have these really tiny leaves. So they're really adapted to extremes. You could fit like if you took one of these, would be smaller than my pinky. We probably could fit several of them on my pinky. Maybe 2 or 3. And so this is our mesquite tree with its bean pods. If anybody's read Barbara Kingsolver's Bean Trees, that's what she's talking about. All of our natives are actually trees that have pods, and the bean part comes from that they fix nitrogen. They have bacteria that are cooperating with the tree and providing nitrogen to the tree. And the tree in turn is providing carbon and other things. And so our trees have very small leaves, and they also, a lot of them have tap roots so they can get through these droughts. So so basically this idea of smooth leaves to ragged leaves is something that has held across time, which is why I think it might hold across space too. But there's some adaptation for this of why that works better for a cooler climate. And scientists on our planet have been able to use the ratio of the smooth leaves to the ragged leaves in fossil findings. Obviously you have to have a fair representation of your fossils, but they can use that to estimate temperature. Size of leaves can also give you a clue, is that you're going to see the large leaves in places where there's a warm climate and enough humidity. And I don't know, we're all familiar with bananas. I don't know how many people have actually seen a banana tree in person, but some of those, well, they're not exactly trees, but a banana plant, some of those leaves they could be like 6 feet long just for one leaf. So tropical leaves can be really huge. So that's just another thing to keep in mind when you're describing vegetation on your climate or how things on your planet. So this is just showing temperature in deep time, how things have changed. And basically we had an ice age back here after the Carboniferous took down a lot of carbon dioxide from the air, greenhouse gases. We went into a really long ice age. That's like 80 million years. But then after that, when it broke out, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, but then we had these hothouse climates. This is our present day temperature. This line here. So you can see these, it doesn't have a scale, but I mentioned some of these climates, they were, like these higher ones were probably 80, 85 degrees for the globe as a whole, but just warmer than today. Then we got into around here when we hit the Oligocene, these would be called warm house climates, but they're still a lot hotter than today. But we did have ice on the Antarctic at that point. And so they, were a little more erratic. And then when we hit this time frame, the Quaternary, that's when the ice really started building up on the North Pole with our Greenland ice. So we've been going through, this is showing the ice ages, we've been going through those ice ages, and interglacials are a little warmer than today by a few degrees Fahrenheit. So that's the kind of stuff we've been dealing with, pretty erratic stuff as it is. But some of that is also our records are better. There's a new paper that's out that gives variability across this whole, well, I think at least from 65 million years. So, I'm sure we'll find a lot more variability here too, but not ice ages. So
I have a
that's,
question. Can you go back to that slide? This is a dumb question, but like, I'm not sure which way this is going. So like, which is the oldest part? Is that on the top?
I'm
or
so sorry. I forgot to explain that.
good. I'm
That
glad
is a
you know.
perfect question because I'm sure there were many people wondering about that. This is going, you're back in time here. This is an older time frame. Permian, the ice age then was like 300 million years ago. We're talking millions of years here, getting back through the Jurassic when the dinosaurs were around. And here's the extinction, the Cretaceous. At the end of the Cretaceous, that's when the dinosaurs became extinct. So it was still warm, after that initial asteroid hit and there was a lot of darkness and cold for a while. Warm, it was still generally warm. And then here we are about 2 million years ago. Actually, this 1.8, this slide is kind of old. We would probably call the Quaternary at 2.6 now, really. But, the ice ages, there have been probably at least 50 ice ages, the evidence suggests. So we've been familiar with about 4 of them from the data looking on the planet. But when you look in the sediments and match those up, there's probably been about 50. Thank you so much for that question. Anybody else? Did I miss anything else? Okay, so that's just to give you an idea of, what we've been dealing with and what kind of things are reasonable. But the ecosystem structure now, so we've been talking about vegetation, but now stepping a little bit back at the bigger picture, like how are all these things fitting together? There's your energy source, and it's usually sunlight, from our sun, soul, or from whatever the local star is. If you're building a world on another planet, that's probably going to be your main energy source. There are some life forms that live on the bottom of the ocean from the thermal heat there, but it's not much, and I don't think you'd cover a planet with that. You've got to have your energy source. Then you've got your physical environment. That includes the air, water, the soil, the climate would count as part of that. Just what are the things influencing life? Those are all, directly or indirectly influenced by the energy source. Well, the soil, for instance, is going to be influenced by the water and the climate and things like that. Then you've got your life forms. And here's where here's the 3, if you want to think of them as 3, and then I'm going to divide the consumers again. But the producers are anything that make their own food. So any planet is going to have somebody that's taking that energy of the sunlight or whatever, if you've got some other energy source, and making it into something that other creatures can use. So here on this planet, we have our plants, and they are making food, photosynthetic plants, algae, and bacteria. I've got a picture of that, so I'm going to wait on describing that in detail. Consumers, anything, any animal. Now we're talking animals, although there's a few like the Venus flytrap, few plants that can be consumers. They eat other living things. And then there's the decomposers that we often forget about. It's actually something I've done some work in because I worked on issues of decay in ecosystems for a while. It took me a little while to get used to that. It's kind of the gross stuff, in the soil and decay, but it's just so important to life. Let me see if I've got that slide here. Well, I mentioned this later, but without the decomposers turning the material that the producers have created and the consumers maybe have eliminated into material, but turning them back into nutrients, you just lock them up. So those guys really do play a crucial role. So here's your producers. You basically got, photosynthesis. Photo actually means light. Synthesis is to make something. So you take your light, you take your carbon dioxide from the air and your water that is coming through the plant from the soil, and those 2 things together are going to give you your sugars and other carbohydrates. And in this I know we tend to think of carbs as starches, but for the context of this science here, we're going to call them sugars and starches, which is how the nutrients tend to think of them, nutritionists and things. So that's the producers. The decomposers are, like I said, any animal that gets its energy and nutrients from animal waste and dead things, whether it's plants or animals. So you've got your mushrooms that can grow on dead things in the soil, or a lot of times you see them growing on dead logs or even dead trees that are still standing. You've got your, bacteria, fungi, termites, maggots, some fish, and vultures. Here's a turkey vulture, that are all helping to decompose things. And here's that part I wanted to mention. So when trees first evolved, this would have been a little over, well, they evolved, let me go back to this one. They were evolving down here, you know, just around wetlands. You started to get some trees, and by trees, I mean woody plants. Plants that they don't just have leaves, now they've got wood, which takes those starches and now turns it into cellulose and really can store it for a long time. And wood is half carbon that used to be carbon dioxide. So the Carboniferous period is aptly named because those woody trees around the swamps were just taking down all kinds of carbon dioxide to the point, because there were no decomposers there, to the point that they brought them into an ice age. That's where we got a lot. That's actually one of the areas, because of all that carbon they brought down in the wetlands, that turns into coal. And that's where we get a lot of our coal from. Even now comes from this period, and the other part is from this period. So that's where a lot of our coal comes from. Now, as far as consumers, we can break those down. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting time frame there to think about, just because where we exist, we think of the ecosystem as the completed circle, right? Everything has its spot. But, you know, if you're doing a science fiction thing, you're hitting a relatively young planet, the circle might not be complete, right? So
really good point. Really good point. So, you know, this is the thing, like Joe said, you'd expect these in a climax kind of situation when your circle is complete. But there can be situations, maybe that's a crisis that your characters are dealing with, a situation where it's incomplete. So that would be a very creative story. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, maybe you've got, or maybe you've lost some of your, you know, like we are dealing with the situation now where we're losing a lot of our carnivores, and a lot of these are keystone predators. So what does that do to the ecosystem? Well, we're going to find out, sadly, and you know, it's not going to be good. So carnivores would be the ones that pretty much eat almost exclusively other animals: mountain lions, praying mantis, lizards, hawks. A lot of the keystone predators are going to be carnivores, or at least omnivores, where they're going to, maybe they'll eat some plants if they're desperate or something. Now, a lot of omnivores can eat plants or animals. We've just had coyote in again, eating our zucchini that we still have, and the javelinas have been going through that patch too. They ate a bunch of cucumbers the other day. So, you know, we're all with them. So they love our gardens because they like what we like. And then, of course, there's the herbivores that are vegetarians: rabbits, cows, seed-eating birds, grasshoppers. Some people, I'm working on it. I'm pretty much a vegetarian. So, you know, we could be technically any of those things, although our system is not designed to be carnivores. So that would be hard to do. But keep in mind, with these consumers then, you know, and producers, you need to have far more producers than you do, you know, your top level consumers. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're trying to design an ecology. You've got to have a lot of producers, and then, you know, then the next level up, primary consumers that are eating the plankton or the plants, or, you know, grazing animals. Then you got your secondary consumers. So maybe you've got, you know, your grass, your rabbit, your coyote eating the rabbit. And who would eat a coyote? Maybe a mountain lion. I don't know. Does anybody eat a coyote? But well, a vulture, but that would be your decomposer. So your, you know, your top prey, your predator, you know, your keystone predator and things like that. There can only be a few of those. Like jaguars, we've got a few jaguars still left roaming this area from time to time, as long as, you know, hopefully the border wall won't lock them out too much. But you know, they have to have a really large area to be able to get enough food, and so we don't expect to have a lot of them in one place. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And, you know, these webs can be complex. You know, the rabbits feeding off the plants. Plants are getting benefits from the sun. That's what they're living off of. Rattlesnakes eating the rabbits. Eagle eating the rattlesnake. There's kind of a better line of predators. So anyway, you can look at that in a lot of different ways. And but that's just another thing to keep in mind when you're developing. Now, I will say that the life forms, some of the life forms I see, they don't strike me as very realistic from laws of physics and things. This is one creature they used for kind of like a horse to walk on in the dark crystal. And I just thought, man, those spindly legs. It kind of reminds me of the elephant thing they made in Star Wars where you just have to trip them up, right? So I don't know how successful that would be from an evolutionary standpoint. And then the Ents, which are one of my favorite characters, I have to say, as a tree lover. Still, they're not very realistic because they have to make their food directly from the sun, so they don't have as much as animals when they're eating the labor of others. But here, their roots where they would get water, they're not even attached. So I don't know how they didn't deal with it. Tolkien didn't deal with that. The people don't always deal with their situation. So, you have definitely some liberty there. So this is just, if you want to write something like Amy Thompson's book, Color of Distance, which is really just tremendous at getting the ecology right. But, there's just, as long as I'm mentioning books, I want to mention this other one, writing fantasy and science fiction that some of you might like. This is one of the authors the lead author here is Orson Scott Card. So that's a good one. He goes into a lot of things, not a lot about the ecology per se, but just a lot of other issues. And as you'll see, I'm not going into anything about the sociology. So he goes into a lot more about culture and social systems. So let's see.
Well, one aspect of herbivores, though, too, is they spend almost all their time eating in order to get enough energy. And so a lot of people don't put that into this. They get to, they can't just be running around doing a lot of things.
That's a really good point, too. So that's a good thing to keep in mind with this pyramid. If that's what you're working on, you're doing a lot of work to get that. That's why, we like when my sister was a firefighter in California years ago, after they were fighting a fire, they brought them a steak, and she was a vegetarian at the time, but she ate that steak because you're all depleted, and that's how you get some quick energy, being at the top here, and energy to really do that hard work. So good point. Yeah, this is actually, now we're going to go into more of basic characteristics of life and whether the planet is a life form. So does anybody have any questions there? I'm going to actually shut my window really quickly because it's a bit chilly. So think of a question and I can still hear you. Okay, and nothing in the chat box. So I guess we'll just go on then. So here are some of the, from a biology 101 standpoint, here are some of the basic characteristics that define life. We say life is organized. It has to take energy and take things and make it into something, Disorganization, entropy is just kind of it's a sign of lack of life. Life requires materials and energy. We've been talking about that with the food chain and things, and also with producers using energy. So we covered that. We haven't exactly talked about this, but I think we all understand this. Living organisms maintain an internal environment, and we understand in the context of temperature, like our body temperature, but there's a lot of other things our body does too. It maintains our pH, our salinity levels, all kinds of things that you could talk about that it's somehow doing without us even thinking about it, which I love, thinking about that. But and that's one, the temperature thing is one I'm going to dwell on a bit. But living organisms respond, whether you're a seed turning into a plant responding to sunlight and water, or whether you're a dog that sees a rattlesnake and jumps back. Hopefully my dogs have learned that now. And living and they have adaptations too. Living organisms have adaptations. So, these are all things we look for in a life form. And then another one being that they reproduce and develop. So that if we looked at what a planet does, we might find that it does a lot of these things. So let's talk a little bit, focusing on this temperature one, and then come back to that concept of whether a planet, well, I guess it's going to be here. So here's just showing you going from an atom into a molecule and into a cell. Now we're starting to get into what we consider life, a cell, and tissues. The tissues come together, they make organs like a brain. The organs make a system, like an organ system, like the nervous system. And then they come into an organism like us, all our organs working together, or a tree. And then they, that organism can be a population of more than one of the same species, or a community of varied species, or an ecosystem. Now you're taking in all the species and all the climate, air, and things like that. And then there's the biosphere. So can a planet be a life form? I'm sorry, we're actually over time now, so I apologize, but should we just keep going with questions, or should I zip through this, Joe? I mean, should I just zip?
Yeah,
Is it all right for going over?
yeah.
Okay. So, if we look at those things, okay, so Gaia theory would say that the planet is a life form. That this is by James Lovelock, and it's basically, life might start from blind chance, but once it establishes itself, it takes over and manages the planet in a way that continues to sustain life. So I think Gaia theory is something that would be especially intriguing for people to think about when they're developing a planet. Like, what are the things on the planet that might help it sustain life? And basically on Earth, life helps set the thermostat that keeps the earthly home within a temperature range that's comfortable for life. Of course, we did mention how life got out of whack before the Permian, and before that ice age, before the decomposers of wood evolved. So it's not perfect. And as you saw from that temperature graphic, I mean, we are talking some really wide extremes from an ice age to a hothouse climate of life surviving. So we're not talking, 72 degrees here, but that's the concept. Life manages, life finds a way. So James Lovelock is the one that came up with that initially. As part of his job was trying to detect life on other planets when he was working for NASA. So he wrote that book, Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth, published in 1979. Some of his scientific papers were in the 60s. So one of the things he saw was that, look, Earth is 21% oxygen and less than 1% carbon dioxide. And meanwhile, Mars and Venus, our neighboring nearby planets, are 98% carbon dioxide and hardly any oxygen. So why is that? And you might remember these plants are taking carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil, and they're releasing oxygen as a waste product. So that's actually a very significant sign of life. When you see something that, equilibrium, it would be natural for carbon dioxide to be around a lot, but for oxygen to be around takes kind of active work all the time by these plants. And so in fact, when they first started photosynthesizing, very early on, the oxygen in the atmosphere actually poisoned a lot of the existing life. And so they had to, then life had to adjust to that, to the oxygen, which we did. And now that we use it in metabolism, and, that's what gives us our burst of energy, and we all need it to survive.
Yeah. That was the first large die-off, wasn't it?
Yes, I believe, because life was so new anyway. The first mass extinction, yeah.
Mass extinction, yeah.
So, it's still kind of mysterious how animals do regulate temperature. I mean, how we do it, we kind of have some ideas, but, a lot of creatures do it within a few degrees, even beehives and termite nests. So Lynn Margulis, who really helped James Lovelock develop his ideas and into Gaia theory, she mentioned, she is passed on now, sadly, but she mentioned that whatever the principle is, they seems to prevail across the planet. So why not a planet? So, we tend to sweat to cool off, and plants also do that, but it's called transpiration. And we can, animals can grow more fur or shed it. Even cold-blooded creatures, the ectotherms, can like bake themselves on a rock to warm up, or, go sit in the shade to cool off, or in a hole. And, there's a lot of things we do, shivering, things we do to be able to regulate our temperature. Besides now we're so advanced, we can even put on sweaters or even heat our air if we need it. But so a planet has four main ways that it can warm or cool. And solar intensity is one of them. Solar intensity tends to get more extreme through a sun, through a star's lifetime. So that's one of the things that led to Gaia theory, is like, wait a minute, the sun should be getting hotter. So why is it that the planet's getting cooler? And you can see how life has an effect on that. Position of continents can also affect it, like that Permian ice age we were talking about. One of the reasons too that it was devastating is so many of the continents were near the poles at that time, and you know, some big ones, and they were closer together. And reflectivity is another one. I'll talk about that in a second. And greenhouse gases is a big one that tends to be, you know, a major topic because it's so important for the current warming we're experiencing. As we're putting in more carbon dioxide from the coal, oil and gas, you know, we're warming up our planet. And I'm not talking a lot about that today, even though that is one of my favorite topics, but for sad reasons. But here's the reflectivity issue. It's known as albedo in general. You know, not all of this, the sun's power is going to reach the planet. Some of it's going to get scattered by clouds. Some of it's even going to get reflected off the planet. Some of it is just reflected by something in the atmosphere. And you can see, you know, this is just a picture I took from a plane. The clouds are lighter colors tend to be more reflective. And you know, this is a forest, actually tends to be dark. They're going to absorb more of the sunshine. Boy, I don't know. I feel terrible that we're running over so much. Should I show this Daisy World video? Is like 3 minutes. And I got it in a link, so I could show it if people are wanting to see how that could work for a planet. Should we do it? Okay, people say yes, let's do it. Thank you all for your patience.
Did you share your sound? Because I don't hear anything. Could be just me.
Oh no, are people hearing it? Is anybody else not hearing it?
Yeah, there's some in the chat that say they're not. Did you press to share the sound before you shared the video?
I didn't know that was a thing. Let me see. Share computer sound. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that, guys. I'll put it back a little bit, not all the way. Thank you for mentioning
more
that, Dawn.
energy and begins to warm the little planet. But now it's too warm for black daisies, but it's just right for the white daisies to blossom and expand. And while the planet is covered with more and more white daisies, they begin to reflect more energy back into space. We call this amount of reflectance albedo. The more reflective the surface of the planet, the higher its albedo. We can think of it as a percentage of how much energy is coming in and then bouncing back out into space. For instance, the albedo of a perfect mirror would be 100%. If we had a completely black surface, the albedo would be 0%.
Not a black surface.
Or a water world, that could be 20%. Now, the white daisies cool the planet again, and that makes it more favorable for black daisies to thrive once again. Now we're back to where we started. The black daisies have taken over, but they'll warm up the planet, and then they'll die, and the white daisies will grow, but then they'll reflect more heat back out, and then they'll die, and on and on and on and back and forth. And over time, within a narrowly defined temperature range, Daisy World stays resilient and makes it possible for daisies to exist at all. Of course, this is a theoretical planet. There are no variables, like rotation, seasons, diseases, geography, or even humans. It does illustrate how a change in one environmental condition can cause a change in a second condition, which in turn can change the first condition again. We call this a feedback loop. The Daisy World model is an example of a negative feedback loop because the initial changes to the climate are muted by the combination of black and white daisies. On Earth, we can see this kind of negative feedback loop with clouds. Let's say increasing temperatures cause more surface evaporation, which cause more cloud formation, and clouds, much like our white daisies, have a higher albedo than the Earth's surface. Then the clouds will reflect more heat and cool the planet. When we look at snow and ice at the poles, which have a high albedo, we can see a positive feedback loop. When temperatures rise, the snow and ice melt, and so even more energy is absorbed by the water. And this continues to melt the snow and ice even further. With increasing climate change, the natural reflectance of our icy poles dramatically declines. Daisy World is a much simpler place than our own planet, but it shows us that maintaining a population on Earth requires a delicate balance with the right organisms and the right range of environmental conditions.
Okay, so I think that does a nicer job than I could ever do of getting those main concepts in. Oops, I guess can you guys hear me now still? Okay, hopefully that won't turn into another video. So there's just an example, but I think you've already seen, the cloud issue is one of the big ones with climate change.
2020 was different, to say the least. We had virtual dance parties and ordered takeout feasts. But before we give 2020 last...
Okay. All right, let me put this back on from current slide.
Yes, the task of trying to get YouTube to shut up.
No, I should have known better. Like it's ever happened before. It didn't have something to follow up. Okay, so we are way over here. Yeah, okay, so we're just about done here, so that's good. So yeah, that's just an example as you can see it. And actually I just wanted to also use this opportunity to say water is dark as seen from space. Now even water, I don't think it's going to absorb 100%, but probably at least 80 or so. But when they said a black surface, that's not just that, we're not talking like a black shirt here. We're talking about black body that doesn't reflect anything. So, but black will absorb more than white. And, and the water, because it takes longer to heat up than land, is going to also, that's another reason it helps moderate temperature swings. So, you're going to probably have to have some water on your planet if you have life. So this is just getting back to that, just showing you the link between carbon dioxide and temperature, which I hadn't really illustrated earlier. This is that same slide on its back now without the color, going from older to the present. So this is warmer, this is colder, and here below is carbon dioxide levels. This is 300 million years ago, roughly, matching with that lower carbon dioxide levels, and then higher and down to where we are now. So even though we're talking about carbon dioxide levels getting higher, part of that is because we've got so much of our civilization built around the coast where the sea level would rise, and those energetic storms and the evaporation rates that can increase drying and other changes that we're just not ready for as a society. So here, this is just another example from the past to the current time, going through the ice ages, just to illustrate again, this being carbon dioxide on the top, temperature on the bottom. So they tend to go together, and keep in mind that carbon connection to life, because the plants are taking down this same carbon dioxide, turning it into tissue. Some of it's getting stuck in, in the soil and turning into coal eventually. Some of it's going back into the air. So that is a very direct line. I think that's it. So that was just a very quick overview. I go into a lot more detail in my book. Sorry for the plug here, but there really is a lot more detail if you really want it. And also feel free to email me if you just want to, talk more about the science fiction angle or things like that, because that's my new love, sci-fi. So I'm trying to work in some of my other stuff into that, because, this is, I don't know. It's just, it's a fun place to be. Lots of fun people and all that. So let me go ahead and stop the share. So let's see. Oh, I see. Everybody was saying they weren't hearing it. Great. Thank you so much for letting me know that you weren't hearing it and stuff. Did anybody, if you're still willing to hang out, I think Joe and I are fine with that. Are you all right with that, Joe? It's 12:20, let's say 10 minutes at the most. If anybody has questions or just wants to talk about their ideas.
I know Brian asked about like superorganisms like slime molds.
Yeah, like if what if one particular slime mold actually took over the entire biosphere?
Now, I thought the slime molds were the ones that kind of got extinct from the oxygen, but they came back.
Oh
Maybe
yeah, they have some
adapted.
slime molds that are acres in size. They're amazing, huge organisms, and they often are just below the surface in the soil. Now they're mostly in the tropics, but what if a well-adapted one?
Where did the chat
Yeah,
go?
that's a great idea. That's a real interesting idea. I mean, a lot of life forms, there's the largest life form, I think, is a big fungi that's under the surface, and aspen trees are all connected. So that's a really cool idea, to bring in those connections. And what about something you see?
Because you can see like aspen forests are actually all clones of a same plant. They're actually all just the rhizomes go through the ground and then they bring up new trunks.
Yeah,
They
so
take over a square mile.
That'd be so we do have a lot of that on our planet, but it'd be interesting to see even more. And what if they took over? You tell me.
I'm just saying there's some small examples of something that could go completely crazy on some other planet.
Yeah. And then you got to wonder, is your life form prepared to manage and take,
well, then you're probably looking at a situation like the Carboniferous period, right? When the trees became too much and killed themselves, right? So at some point that slime mold thing screws itself out.
Right. It could eventually just run too far in one direction and wind up killing itself off.
Yeah. That'd be an interesting thing to consider, like someone trying to deal with that issue.
Of course, then too, you can look at humans. We are that. We are a certain species that is taking over the planet and driving it off the cliff.
Kind of feels like a cancer sometimes, doesn't it? But we don't have to be. We don't have to be. I like to think of humans as the salt of the earth, that we're kind of essential here, but too much is a bad thing, too many humans. And also, you can really, I don't know, you can get into trouble, but you can be a good thing.
Yep. If we get our collective heads out of our asses.
Any other thoughts?
I got a question in the chat about volcanoes to equal global dimming.
Yes. Well, and that's a good one. I didn't include anything about aerosols here because it just seemed like there was so much already. But that is an important part of climate too that should be addressed. So thanks for bringing that up. Basically, the volcanoes were an interesting thing in time because, and even now, what we see is their short-term effect, like from Mount Pinatubo in 91 or 2, it spews up a lot of material beyond the clouds, beyond where the clouds can reach, so that it can't get rained down very easily. It takes a year or two for that stuff to come down. And in the meantime, they're basically like sulfate particles would be kind of like little tiny screens or something. They're dark particles that are not letting the sun come through. Actually, we've seen that sulfate is what's in most of pollution. So some of us might be like me, might be old enough to remember when pollution used to come out in dark stacks before they cleaned a lot of the sulfur out of it. Be like that. Now, volcanoes have a long-term effect of warming the climate because when they're releasing sulfates, they're also still releasing a lot of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So that's their long-term effect. But in the short term, we saw that after Mount Pinatubo, it got really cold, chilly. Anyway, our temperature was relatively cold for a year, and that's still something that we can see. And we currently see it with our pollution. Less so here since we've been cleaning up, but I lived in China for a while, about 25 years ago or so, and they had not cleaned up their sulfur, and the air was dark. You hear a lot about the Chinese pollution. The rivers were black, so that was still having a big effect. And that is one of the concerns when more countries do clean up their pollution. It's really good for the long term, keeping the warming not as bad. But in the short term, the local people might see the difference, kind of the difference between a dark cloud over you or not, where you feel more sun when there's not that layer of particles.
Right. Or like London back in the late 1800s, where everything was covered with soot from all the coal,
Yes.
everything, all the coal being burned everywhere in every house, in every
Right.
factory.
Yeah, we're lucky they cleaned up too.
Yeah, I did hear, I don't know if you've heard this before, but there was at least one proposal that, well, two of them. One is a violent one, whereas you take turns dropping nukes into volcanoes around the world to put stuff up into the higher atmosphere to help cool the atmosphere,
Oh,
cool
good
the
Lord.
planet. But the thing is that you get all these sulfates and then you get acid rain, and you don't want that. But you get, but there is someone who took that idea and went a different direction. It was the idea of taking extremely small microparticles of aluminized mylar and spreading it up in orbit. And detonating it up in orbit and spreading it out wide to give a more reflective surface to cut down on solar radiation. The only thing I can think of that is a big problem is that once you've got it to where the world temperature is where you want it, how do you turn that off?
Yeah, and that brings up some other issues. I was actually on a panel one time on climate change with Roger Angel, who's talked about putting a big screen like that in space. They probably refined it a little more now. And one thing that makes me nervous about that is then you're cutting down your solar radiation that's, evaporating your water, so it's putting moisture in the air, and also the sun that plants need. So I think you'd have to place it very carefully. Maybe if you place that over the Sahara, I don't know how much it would stay where you put it, if it's just going to spread out across the whole planet. So I don't know. It makes me so nervous when humans try these big projects, nukes and stuff. I wish we would just work with nature and let nature do its business, because somebody just had a question here about the fires. And so I'm going to use that as an opportunity to go into how nature does it. Is these plant, basically in a warmer climate, there's more plants growing, more trees, taking up more carbon dioxide, and also something I did not get into in this talk, making a big difference on the surface. I think we can all agree it's much more pleasant under the forest canopy than in a harsh desert on a hot day, So they're just that those trees are making life more conducive, making the climate more conducive to life. Now, what happens when a bunch of them are burning like this year? Wow, that was such a bad issue. I mean, it's not just carbon dioxide that's going up when the trees burn, it's methane. I was surprised to find out. I did an analysis with Tom Swetnam he used to run the tree ring lab over here in Arizona. And and it's a lot of methane that's actually getting into the air, which is another greenhouse gas that's even more potent. But so there is a lot of gas getting in there. Now the trees are dead, so they're not photosynthesizing. And I will say, though, a lot of the models, they'll tend to, because, the computer models that look at this, they'll tend to just say, oh, that forest burned. Well, let's just put all that carbon that used to be in the trees back in the air now. That's not how it works. If you go to that forest, and I just went up to Mount Lemmon about 3 weeks ago to see the burn there, what you will see is there's a lot of charcoalized trees there. And so they are, basically a lot of that carbon is now locked up in charcoal that'll, get into the soil, and the trees will keep growing. So, depending on your fires, there used to be a lot more fires, even than the amount of acreage that burned this last summer was still a lot smaller than what we would have gotten, especially when Native Americans were around, had control of managing the landscape. Because they were doing a lot of fires for grazing animals to, improve grazing conditions and stuff. But what those fires were not burning the trees down like these are, because these fires, oh my gosh, some of those fires in Oregon and places that are not used to fires, that's a really bad sign. That one scared me more than some of this other stuff, because we need our wetlands, we need our moist forests. And if they're drying out enough to burn, that's those fires in the long run could definitely really hurt us and really start changing those ecosystems. You know, if there's not enough moisture to support that kind of forest, those could turn into ponderosa, or our ponderosa forest could turn into grasslands or juniper forest. So, you know, those fires are a big deal. And in the Amazon ones, even more so as far as climate goes. But yeah.
But the Amazon ones are often, or at least initially, were caused by humans in order to clear for pasture land to raise cattle. And that's like going the exact wrong direction for what the climate needs.
Exactly the wrong direction. And now they've cleared so much that that can really mess things up, because now more hot, dry air can get in there. And yeah,
and then they had fires that spontaneously were caused, or maybe got out of control in the Amazon because it's been allowed to dry so much that it could actually spread.
That's right. And someone here, let's see, Tina is saying that fires also release lead from leaded gasoline. That's a scary thought. I hadn't really thought about that one. And how many volcanoes would be required to equal the current global dimming? Yeah, that one, I don't know, but the global dimming, you know, there were those kind of volcanoes in the past. I think we already did address that question for the most part, but I don't know the number offhand. But
there was at one time there was a massive volcanic event 100 million years ago or something that it was part of a big mountain building area, and that was like a nuclear winter time during the geologic history.
Which time was that, did you say?
I thought it was something like about 100 million years ago or so. I don't remember. It was something or other shield was a big formation of volcanoes.
Well, the Cretaceous, which was 100 million years ago, there were a lot of volcanoes going on at that time, but that was a really warm period. I use that as one of my hothouse examples. Yeah. Which is not to say that there weren't some time frames that were, you know, when the dimming is overtaking the cooling, certainly, you know, years or decades at a time. I'm sure there were a lot of challenges. Yeah.
Let's see if
Thank you, Julie. So we're at 12:33, so this might be a good time to close off. Luckily, we can still catch the other talk, even the one that started at noon, because it's all going to be recorded. Thank you so much for all you've been doing for this conference, Joe. This is really exciting to have it all recorded like that.
No, thanks. It's a big team. That's why we got other stuff going on now. I'm dealing with emergencies. It's just like a regular TusCon. There's all kinds of crap pulling me many different directions. But thanks.
Well, I'm glad my internet holds. What's that?
I think we had the real David Drake on for a while, so that's kind of cool.
Oh, that's cool.
Wow, cool.
I'm gonna say it was, unless he tells me not to.
Nice. And I see I had some members of my family, so thanks guys for coming out, and everybody that I don't know. Thank you. Also, it was just great to have a chance to talk. I missed the interaction. You know, we'll have to get that next year more. You can actually see people and talk to them, but it's nice to hear from you.
Yeah.
See your name there.
All righty, folks. Thank you. Thanks for
coming in. Thank you very much, Melanie.
Thank you, everybody.
Zoom for the Tales from the Set panel, which is going on now. If you want to just click over and do that. And then I've got housework to do to make this thing happen. Thanks, everybody. Bye.